But what about German-Russian economic integration? Doesn't this make sense for Germany? So why would Germany support sanctions on Russia?
Well, they don't. I guess the short answer is that when it really comes to it, they don't. You got to remember, though, this habit of subordination, right, of cringing obedience to the Anglo-Americans is very deep, and in Germany it's especially deep because of the world wars and the occupation and so forth. So what happened with this was Merkel, of course, I think she's a fool, and she's a profoundly stupid woman who spouts the garbage that her advisors tell her. You also have to remember she grew up a commie. She comes from East Germany, but with a difference in that her father was a Lutheran minister in East Germany, but unlike many Lutheran ministers, her father was a collaborationist. Her father played ball with the commies, and that's why Merkel is who she is, where she is. Because her father was a communist collaborator in East Germany, she got to go to university, she got to become a chemist, she got her entire post-communist career out of this fact, right? And this was not really that common among convinced Lutheran ministers in East Germany. So she shoots her mouth off all the time. And then, these people, we have Volkswagen and Siemens, I think, and a number of very big, highly successful German export companies saying, essentially they say behind the scenes, shut up, back off. And the way they've also done it is they sent out Helmut Schmidt, who I think is a very interesting figure. Helmut Schmidt, of course, was chancellor between the 70s and the 80s. And if you want to look for an elder statesman in Germany, it's Helmut Schmidt. I would actually say in the world, it may well be Helmut Schmidt. He's about 90, and he has always a highly interesting take on things. And Helmut Schmidt's line is to say, what Putin is doing is completely understandable given Russian history, Russian security needs, and so forth, and we should simply cool it, right? We should not engage in these things. And very soon after that, Merkel said, okay, no more sanctions. But she's always being pressed by the British, the U.S., to go further down this road.
What about the natural gas lines running into and through Ukraine from Russia? How does the import and export of gas affect the present crisis? I mean, with regard to Europe as well.
You go back to the early 70s, right? There was the Oranienburg pipeline. This was the first of the big Russian Soviet gas lines to Western Europe. And all the U.S. war hawks were saying, no, we don't want that because that'll create dependence. Well, there are three big lines that go from east, the Russian gas fields to Germany, to Italy, and then to some others. But those are the two. Those are also the ones that are going to get destroyed if economic sanctions go through. Germany will suffer the most, and Italy close behind, right? Those are the ones. Now, Putin has attempted to go around the Ukraine by building the Nord Stream pipeline, which goes from Russian territory directly to Germany. And the purpose of this is to avoid these turbulent, unstable countries, be it Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, and I'm afraid Poland also might fall into this category under people like the Kaczynski twins. But the Nord Stream is working, that's fine. And then he wanted to do the South Stream, right, from the Black Sea across Turkey, the Balkans, and then Italy, and then into Europe that way. And that has not been built. The U.S. has successfully blocked that one. Now, the question, therefore, is the Ukrainians say, we won't pay, we can't pay. Well, up to now, the Russians have been subsidizing Ukraine with a price that is way below the market price. But if you want a political price, you've obviously got to fulfill political conditions, right? Good neighbor kind of stuff, right? No hysterical Russophobia neo-Nazi campaigns. But no, that's what the boys from Lvov, that's their stock in trade. So at this point, Putin is saying to them, you guys love the market, I know. Pay the market price. That's all he's saying. We're not prepared to subsidize you when you're a hostile country. I don't see anything so scandalous about this. Now, how could they, in fact, exist? I would say two things. They have to be a neutral country. They actually passed a law in 2010 that they would be neutral. Again, like Sweden after World War II, like Finland, like Switzerland, like Austria. All these were neutral. All did fine. And it means you cannot join NATO. Anybody who wants Ukraine to join NATO should have his head examined. Kissinger says no. Brzezinski says no. Helmut Schmidt says no. Anybody who knows anything says no, no, no. We don't want to drive the NATO states right up to the Russian border because in 1991, Manfred Werner, the head of NATO, promised Moscow, Gorbachev, that there would not be any more expansion of NATO. They even said, we won't let the NATO forces into East Germany. And, of course, what they've done is they've got Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, right? All of these are NATO members. Georgia wants to be a NATO member. No, no, no. And again, from the American point of view, you want to fight and die for some tin pot fascist like Saakashvili of Georgia or Yarosh? Yarosh wants to have Ukrainian nuclear missiles that he can fire at the world. No, I'm sorry. This cannot be. So the one side is neutrality. You can call it Finlandization, right? You got to remember, Finland in World War II worked with Hitler, was an ally of the Nazis, hand in glove with Hitler. At the end of World War II, Stalin wisely said, look, we're not going to roll you over. We're going to let you exist. But here are the conditions. You don't join NATO, and you suppress wild anti-Soviet, anti-Russian opinion. We can't tolerate that. So you're going to crack down on these people. That worked pretty well. The other thing then is this question of a confederation. In other words, it's clear there are two parts, right? It would be like Austria-Hungary, right? Like a dual monarchy, but a confederation with a capital that would do defense and foreign policy and nothing else. So all the police powers and all the rest of that would be more than the U.S., right? Because it would be not a federation, but a confederation, which is weaker, right? Like the Confederate States of Ukraine. It would have a very weak central government, and that would then allow the East and the West to coexist. But, of course, the people from Lvov say, no, we demand it all. I think the people from Kharkov and Donetsk are more reasonable. They just say, look, we want our own autonomous region. But I don't see that lasting very long as a perspective, precisely because the people in the fascist forces are such chauvinists that they wouldn't accept it. So the idea is neutral and a confederation. Now, what's a good example, right? A country that's even more divided than Ukraine, where you have people speaking French, German, Italian, Rhaeto-Romanish, right? It's Switzerland. Switzerland is a confederation. The official name of Switzerland is Confederatio Helvetica. That's the Latin name of the country. That's the real name. And then it's neutral, and it's been neutral for several hundred years. And they do fine, right? And this is not my idea of a country, but for them, it's just what they need.
Well, the other alternative, of course, is that it becomes reintegrated into Russia, right?
Yes, certainly the entire part, I'd like to say east of the Dnieper River, but it's more than that. It's really a kind of a diagonal line that goes from north of Kharkov across the Dnieper and down towards Odessa, because Odessa is a classic Russian city as well. So it would be a third and perhaps more than a third of the existing land mass that I think at the current rate it looks like this. If the right sector sends fascist thugs with weapons to try to attack these buildings in eastern Ukraine, then Russia will have to intervene to restore order, was the 19th century expression. And that's fine with me. I have no compunctions about this. The U.S. owes Ukraine exactly nothing. Nothing. There's no treaty. They're not in NATO. This is not our responsibility. And anybody who says it is crazy.
Now, what was CIA Director John Brennan doing in Kiev?
Well, the weekend that he was there, which is this past weekend, right? The weekend being the 12th and 13th of April. On the second day of his visit, the puppet president Turchinov said, we're going to use violence, we're going to use military force against protesters who are occupying these buildings. Now, you remember, the entire diplomatic establishment of NATO kept telling Yanukovych, don't use force, don't use force. I think Yanukovych had reasons of his own not to use force, but Yanukovych ends up as Chicken Kiev, right? He could have dispersed these fascists with a little bit of gunfire, right? But he didn't do it. In this case, the order is coming from Brennan, not to exercise restraint or to avoid civilian losses, but by all means, go in there and do the killing. And the last thing I think that is relevant is to ponder this from the human point of view, because I've tried to argue that what Putin is doing is highly beneficial for the world. The world needs an approximate balance. It needs some kind of a counterweight to this preponderance of the U.S., which, again, has brought out the worst of American society at home and abroad, and is simply not viable. And it's got to end, and we're just hoping it would end peacefully, because it has been a terrible, just think of the Iraq War as a typical event, or the bombing of Libya, right? These horrendous things that have gone on, the bombing of Yugoslavia, acts of colossal historical vandalism. Putin is essentially there to somehow push back, to contain that. I would actually go further. I would say, if you look at what is Putin requesting, right? What does he want, right? All the commentators ask this. He obviously wants Russian interests to be respected, right? Not attacked, not wiped out. And even further, I think, we got a solution for the Ukraine. We ought to think about a solution for the world. I would say a Russian-U.S. condominium would be the answer for Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, at minimum, and maybe beyond that. In other words, the U.S. and Russia working together, for example, would be able to do what Kerry can't do, to impose a solution on the Israelis and the Palestinians, who otherwise will never agree, right? Whatever you think. A reasonable solution, because we cannot have these little countries, whatever they are, right? And these places like Ukraine, you cannot have these places causing world conflagrations. It's just not worth it. There's a very good quote from Bismarck where he says, I just hope that some big war doesn't start with some stupid thing in the Balkans. Well, that was Sarajevo, right, 100 years ago. Sarajevo, 100 years ago this spring, right, was the stupid thing in the Balkans that caused, 25 million people to lose their lives, right? One of the greatest catastrophes of civilization. So what we would need is this U.S.-Russian joint approach. Then you could simply impose a solution on Ukraine. If people are recalcitrant, if they're going to be unreasonable, then the interest of world stability, international peace and security, and economic development could be brought in. What I'm trying to say is, when you compare these people, right? You compare the Russians, who have been through the mill, right? They've been wiped out economically. They had hyperinflation in 1992. They had hyperdeflation in 1998. They lost their country, right? They've been shocked all these different ways. Somehow, these individuals are bigger, they're more complete, they're less mutilated, less deformed, less decadent, less degenerate than the specimens we see on the other side. So what you're seeing is imperialism in action. And whether a person can have integrity, or whether somebody can become great or not, generally depends on what a given social formation is willing to accept. How much reality? So I'd have to say the ability of the United States political establishment culturally to accept reality is extraordinarily low. Whereas the Russians, I think they are much more reality-oriented, and that's a huge kind of plus that they have going. But I would urge everybody to think about it also in those terms.